I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Matt Bernico.
And I'm Dean Detloff.
Dean, I'm so full of tofurkey because it's American Thanksgiving.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I
just an announcement. Nothing really special about that.
I'm full of some blueberry pie that Emily made in our apartment because we're American expats living in Toronto and nobody knows that it's Thanksgiving.
Nice. It sounds good, actually.
Well, we already had one, so... Man, side note, okay, I didn't plan to talk about this, but Emily was telling me the history of Thanksgiving today and in Canada, and I'm not 100% sure about how all these details really work out, but here's the rumor that I'll tell you without having done any other research. The rumor that I heard is that Thanksgiving was created in Canada to combat Darwin's Origin of Species and evolution, because it was like a weird Christian nationalist establishment to try to bring people into like a good Canadian Christian identity with the state, and also to say thanks in Canada for not being in the middle of a civil war like the United States. So just an extremely bizarre origin.
Holy crap, that is a bizarre origin.
Like I said, there's probably more to it, but I'm not going to go look it up right now.
Well, on this podcast, we believe in evolution, and also we think the Civil War was one worth fighting.
That's right. Extremely on brand for Canada. All right, that's not what we're talking about this week, though. We are talking about class, kind of. Last week, we talked about how class analysis is really important for Christians and how Christians inoculate themselves against thinking about class. There's lots of ways that Christians don't like to do it or try not to think about it. We also made some digressions into like complicating this idea in order to demonstrate how useful and dynamic class analysis can be. And I think in light of that, we also have a responsibility in this episode to do a little bit more tugging at that idea of class and class oppression by talking through the problem where people on the left reduce all struggles down to class struggle, which is a huge problem for some on the left, for some Marxists, but more generally just kind of some internet lefties, you might say. We've definitely mentioned class reduction a handful of times on the podcast before, but here's a whole episode about it and what you should know. So we can talk about class reductionism explicitly. We'll talk about some of the contributions and corrections that other people make when it comes to the ways that different conditions maybe factor into that analysis of class. But the real key here is to try to demonstrate that after we spent a whole episode talking about class, class by itself also isn't completely adequate to explain material conditions or oppression or liberation, even if you want to get a handle on capitalism. So, Matt, why don't I send us right over to you to introduce the problem here? What's class reductionism about?
Yeah, well, let me tell you. Well, last week we were talking about how, the main motivator of history is the class against class struggle, right? That's what Marxism is all about. But class reduction is a sort of misstep, I think, in applying or analyzing class. So class reduction is like a political analysis that ends up leaning way too heavily on locating class as the main motivator of history, of struggle, of contradictions within capitalism and all these things, right? It's one of the motivating forces, but I think locating it as the only motivating force, or like not understanding how to understand other forces along with them, kind of ends up being a problem. So the problem with class reduction and like thinking about it in just terms of class is that it undercuts the influence of other struggles like race and gender and everything else on the particular way capitalism works and exploits people. Yeah, I mean, I think on like the internet left, Dean, like you mentioned a minute ago, has like a real tendency to uh misunderstand, be willfully ignorant of, and just not be very kind towards the whole idea of identity politics. And I think there's some
Mhm.
criticism to be made of identity politics, but I think that if you understand it the right way, you understand it as a sort of co-conspiratorial force, I guess, against in the oppression of people. I think it ends up really helping more than it does hurt. So all that to say, class reduction is bad, and we want to be better understanders of the oppression of people. So not just class, but all these other factors as well. So that's what we're gonna do. Um, I think that this like the friction between Marxist like class reduction and identity politics, I think it comes out like the most clear when people talk about racism and capitalism and like the relation between those two things. um that's probably the place where like I think this becomes like the most clear, or it's the place where you see it happen the most, but there's other places that it happens just as much, just maybe less obviously happening. So anyways, I thought it'd be good to kind of get the conversation going and use this quote by Stuart Hall, who is a really cool Caribbean and British cultural theorist and also Marxist. He was a real legit guy. Just Google Stuart Hall. Do yourself a favor. If you're in cultural studies, if you do communication studies or media studies, he's a guy you got to know about. And people don't read him enough. Stuart Hall. There you go. Anyways, Stuart Hall says this about race. He says, race is a modality in which class is lived. It's also the medium in which class relations are experienced. It determines some modes of struggle. So there's a lot more to say. I mean, Stuart Hall writes about this a lot, actually. But I think this is a really interesting way to put it, though, right? That there is class, like that's a material factor in the lives of every single person, but it's always, I mean, tinted by, influenced by, completely structured by the racial experience of a person. So you can't just kind of like, narrow in on one thing or the other. It has to be kind of both of these things understood together. So it's just like a good place to start thinking through it. Yeah, what do you think, Dean?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the way that you laid it out is exactly right. In terms of like class is important to understand, right? And the problem with a sort of liberal expression of identity politics is that it doesn't bring class into it, right? And it's true that class is a radicalizing moment in the kind of network of all kinds of oppression, right? Like once you understand a class basis for capitalism, you can start building solidarity in interesting ways, and you can also understand how to intervene in, doing things like strikes and why labor is important and all that kind of stuff. But if, like you said, Matt, if you don't understand the way that class is permeated by all kinds of other dominating factors that are not reducible to class, but are kind of mutually constitutive for an oppressive society with class, then you're going to end up actually undercutting any way that you have to build solidarity. I mean, I always think of that quote at the very beginning of our every podcast that we do from Amoria, where she says in our intro, if you don't attend to something like anti-black racism, then you can't build class solidarity. It holds you back from doing that. So in that sense too, it's almost like if you really want to understand class, you have to understand how class relates to everything else. Otherwise, you're not going to be very successful, both as an analyst or as an organizer.
Yeah, I think that's right. You gotta have them both. That's a that's a good one. Speaking of Amaria, that reminds me of another quote from her, actually, from an essay that we talked with her about not too long ago, during this past summer. She wrote an article in the Bias magazine called Christian Order and Racial Order, What Cedric Robinson Has to Teach Us Today about Racial Capitalism. I think it is really helpful in making this larger point about race and class together. So this is what Maria says. The mistake that many Christian socialists make is reducing a radical understanding of law, order, and economy to class and money. The inadequacies of these analyses become clear as soon as the white leftists attempt to substitute class terms like proletarian as the primary agents of an uprising that is specifically linked to black and radical tradition. While understanding the operations of class is crucial for any radical movement, one rooted in Black radical understandings of economy recognizes that race, specifically Blackness, is foundational to the imagination of order because it's foundational to the imagination of existence in the West. So what Amaria is getting at here is really pretty good, right? That you can't just reduce everyone to the proletariat. You have to recognize the ways that the proletariat is racialized and coded, sort of as part of the law and order sort of class, or not, right? These play into the ways we think about labor and the way that we think about race, and they're like kind of inexplicably tied up, right? You can't just shake them loose from one another so easily. Yeah, I think that it's a pretty good place to get started in thinking about racial capitalism and not class reduction.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so you've introduced a great and important term, racial capitalism. We should take a minute to sort of parse that out, thinking through Amoria's stuff as well. Okay, so one way of doing a class reductionist story about how the world works and how society works is to say, look, sure, there's lots of oppression in society. There's gender inequality, there's racial inequality, all that stuff is real, but deep down, ultimately, the ultimate oppression is class. And if you could figure out how to solve the class problem, you would figure out all the rest of it, right? They would all sort of tumble like dominoes, that all of these other oppressions are just ways to divide the working class. So if you can just kind of put them off to the side, then you can get serious. What I think is really interesting about something like racial capitalism, which is a term that was introduced by Cedric Robinson, or at least developed by Cedric Robinson, and then further developed by all kinds of other folks, is that it tries to say, well, you can't just talk about class as this sort of isolated thing. Anytime you talk about the development of capitalism, you're always also talking about the invention of race as a particular productive way of understanding in the West, in the world. And so race and capitalism always come together. One of the most controversial, but I think really compelling imaginative exercises that racial capitalism forces you to do is to say, could there be a kind of capitalist society without racism? And racial capitalism says no. It would always be moving race around, potentially. Maybe it wouldn't be the same kind of racism that we see today, just like racism before anti-Black racism looked a bit different. That's kind of Cedric Robinson's interesting genealogical research. But nevertheless, capitalism would always kind of generate racialized understandings. And I think that is like a really compelling point. And the line at the end here of what the passage you read from Amoria is helpful, right? She says that race, specifically Blackness, is foundational to the imagination of order because it's foundational to the imagination of existence in the West. So if you were like a bad kind of materialist, a lazy materialist, a vulgar one, as one might say, you might say imagination, we don't need to think about that at all, right? That's idealist, an idealist way of thinking about the world. What we really need is the material. But what Amoria and so many other theorists try to say is, if you really want to understand the material, you better get your head around how the imagination works, right? Because it has real effects on how we organize society and how people actually really live. So I think racial capitalism is one great tradition that kind of sets up some other coordinates for thinking about how all these things go together.
I think that's pretty good. I actually really appreciate too the can you imagine a capitalism without racism? I think it's a helpful thought experiment. You could probably take it in the other direction too, though. Can you imagine socialism and being like with racism? And like,
Right.
yes, you can, right?
Yeah.
Changing the economic order of things doesn't necessarily change the racial order of things. So I think it's a helpful criticism and way of thinking all the way through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another really important theorist, just to continue on this racial capitalism track, is Robin D.G. Kelly. He was a student of Robinson and also just really fantastic interpreter of Robinson's work and has done a lot of great stuff himself. By the way, I think we've mentioned this book on the show before, but if you ever want to read an extremely cool thing about communism and Christianity, read the book Hammer and Hoe that Kelly wrote, which is a history book about Black sharecroppers in Alabama and the CPUSA. Lots of really cool Christian stuff in there. Anyway, this is not from that. But Kelly also explains this really well in a passage where he says, capitalism and racism did not break from the old order, but rather evolved from it to produce a modern world system of racial capitalism dependent on slavery, violence, imperialism, and genocide. capitalism was racial not because of some conspiracy to divide workers or justify slavery and dispossession, but because racialism had already permeated Western feudal society. Now, I think what's important here is race does divide workers and it does justify slavery and dispossession, right? Like it does function that way. But what Kelly is suggesting is it's not the case that like some some brilliant bourgeois business owner one day was like, aha, I know how to stop these union folks from organizing. We'll tell them that some of them are like this and some of them are like that, right? It's actually way more complicated because racialized understandings precede capitalist political economy, and they all end up doing very weird things as capitalism develops.
That's right. It didn't just come out of nowhere. It already existed. Speaking of that, actually, here's one more good quote I'll throw at you, and then maybe we can have a bigger discussion about this. This is from an article that Nick Estes and Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz wrote in the Monthly Review a few months back. So this is what they say about racial capitalism. They say, capitalism was not a radical break or rupture from European feudalism or the old order. In many ways, it was a continuation of it. Racialism was seated in European social orders before the dawn of capitalism, creating racial hierarchies that formed early class structures. The racially subordinated Europeans, if they were not outright eliminated, normally labored and worked the land on behalf of the ruling classes. Immigrant workers were usually placed at the bottom of the racial hierarchy. So I think what's really helpful here too in thinking about capitalism and racial capitalism as a helpful sort of like systemic analysis is that some of the myths that we tell ourselves about the development of capitalism, even as Marxists, right, is that it was in some ways progressive, and I think that's a helpful myth to dispel. The sense sometimes even Marx says things like, capitalists are the really revolutionary class. They're always revolutionizing the means of production. They're always kind of finding more and more ways to suck up surplus labor and your labor time and trying to get everyone on board as a worker, right? Capitalism does that. But I think unless you really attend to things like anti-Black racism or the colonization of the United States and the the genocide of Native people, right? Unless you attend to like the ways that capitalism does function sort of racially, you kind of miss a lot of the ways that capitalism really works. It's not just about formulating a big homogenous chunk of labor, but it has a lot of texture to it when you really get down to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's also helpful because, as important as Marx is, and, we're Marxists for sure, like, he's very important. As important as he is, he does also need to be supplemented by all kinds of other stuff and even challenged and criticized by other kinds of discourses. Racial capitalism is one of them, I think. But I always think of, there's a really interesting theorist named Samir Amin who passed away not long ago, but he contributed a lot to the Monthly Review as well. And he did lots of studies on imperialism and colonialism. And he has this really interesting theory about imperialism where, like Lenin said that imperialism is the highest form of capitalism, that once you get to a certain stage of capitalist development, then there's no choice but to be an imperial power. But Samir Amin actually says that imperialism and capitalism are always together from the very, very beginning, like all the way back to colonization, obviously, right? An important imperialist moment in history. And I think that it's important to attend to those kinds of analyses, right? Of people who are looking at oppression in a multifaceted sort of way and not trying to throw Marx under the bus, but to say look, there's more that we have to pile on here if we really want to understand what's going on.
Yeah. I like that idea though from Amin, right? It's not that imperialism is the highest form of capitalism. It's that imperialism is just capitalism.
Mm-hmm,
So that's pretty cool. All right, well, let's turn I know we're gonna we're sort of just gonna run through some of these things and not pay as much attention to them as we could, but let's turn really quickly to talk about gender and capitalism as well, because that's one of those that's one of the vertices of identity politics that people talk about but sometimes neglect.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say about the ways that gender and capitalism sort of work co-collaboratively. I don't know why I keep using those types of words, but they are they work together to sort of produce a certain type of workforce. And And there are things that Marx and Engels both say about women in capitalism that are kind of interesting, but they're definitely not exhaustive or even like all that helpful in a lot of ways. So I mean, there's a few different places to go to. Engels talks about it really explicitly in some places, but in the Communist Manifesto, there's this really interesting chunk that Marx and Engels parse out some things about the role of women in capitalism that I think is interesting. But like, I mean, you'll see the shortcomings here pretty quickly. So this is from the Communist Manifesto. The bourgeois sees his wife as a mere instrument of production. He hears that instruments of production are to be exploited in common and naturally can come to no other conclusion that the lot of being common to all will likewise fall to women. He has not even a suspicion that the real point aimed at is to do away with the status of women as mere instruments of production. So there's actually, I mean, within the context of the Communist Manifesto, there's this kind of like ironic sort of play that Marx and Engels are doing here, where the bourgeoisie have this sort of like jab that they take at communists, like, well, are they even going to hold their women in common or something like that? And Marx is like, well, that's basically the way the bourgeois think of their wives to begin with. It's just instruments of production that they can exploit in common. And okay, so Marx is onto something here, that there's like this thing about women in capitalism, but this doesn't actually get at anything systemic. This is more of like a jab or like an ironic sort of turn than it is like real analysis. So I think there's a lot more to say about gender and capitalism than Marx or Engels writes about.
It's important to mention that Engels and Marx both think that women's liberation is very important, and uniquely important for sure. And there's a whole tradition of Marxist feminism that has found lots of intriguing texts in Marx and Engels both, and also have found it necessary to sort of push beyond them or radicalize them more than Marx and Engels ever did. There are some kind of suggestive ways of understanding Engels in particular, as potentially suggesting that gender oppression precedes class oppression, and so there's this kind of this preceding form of oppression that ends up informing capitalism in a unique sort of way. There's debate among Marxists, but if you wanted one person who I think offers a kind of forceful and interesting argument to this effect, it would actually be the work of Luce Irigaray. There's like a ton of Marxist feminists, and she's one of the weirdest ones. So maybe that's why I'm suggesting her, because she is extremely bizarre, but she has some really sophisticated analyses of gender under capitalism, and she really kind of like highlights and runs with that insight from Engels and others, and then runs way past them, I think, but in ways that sort of illustrate, right, that the Marxist tradition has these openings for understanding other forms of oppression, but we have to step through that door a lot more readily than Marx and Engels did.
That's cool. Luce Irigaray, you're right. It's a wild place to start, but I guess just get into it,
She's awesome.
Someone else, yeah, for sure. Someone else you could check out too, who is, I think, a little bit more straightforward, is Silvia Federici. I mentioned Federici on the show last week, but I'm going to mention her again because I think she does a really great job of, I think, parsing the ways that capitalism works with the idea of patriarchy to produce a workforce without people even like really understanding that's the case. I feel like, I mean, Federici is something I read, I think, when I was like in a master's degree program, and I think it's probably been one of the most important things I've ever read, just because it's it's a powerful essay that really explains the ways that gender and capitalism are tied up together. So let's see. So she has an essay called "Wages for Housework," and the essay is really fascinating because it is like lots of Marxist analysis, but it's also like a pretty actionable type of activist writing. Like she has a program. She's trying to get you to do something. But I'm going to read this a little bit here, and then we can talk about it. So Federici says this: "It is important to recognize that when we speak of housework, we are not speaking of a job as other jobs, but we are speaking of the most pervasive manipulation, the most subtle and mystified violence that capitalism has ever perpetrated against any section of the working class." A big claim, but I think she's onto something. True. Under capitalism, every worker is manipulated and exploited, and his or her relation to capital is totally mystified. The wage gives the impression of a fair deal. You work and you get paid. Hence, you and your boss are equal, while in the reality, the wage, rather than paying for the work you do, hides all the unpaid work that goes into its profit. To have a wage means to be part of a social contract, and there's no doubt concerning its meaning. You work not because you like it, but because it comes naturally to you, but because it's the only condition under which you are allowed to live. So there's a lot going on here, but I think this is kind of like the crux of it. Um, like you work for a wage, and like there's a certain sort of like straightforward logic to it. You're selling your labor time, your your boss is getting the profit. This is the arrangement, right? But housework is this like interesting type of labor because it doesn't have a wage, and it is like even more mystified. Like, why do women do it is kind of her the big idea behind her essay. It's expected of them, not because like it's like a neutral sort of exchange of labor and capital, because women don't get paid for housework. Instead, it's like this is just what women naturally do. It comes naturally to them, so of course they do it. It's this whole like wild, just like she says, mystification of labor and the way in the relationship to capital that women share, that like just kind of flies under the radar of every single person unless they actually think about it. I think it's a really fascinating way to go about it, because like it's wild too, because like none of our society works whatsoever without the domestic labor of women, or whoever's doing it. But like within like the within the gender norms that capitalism must sort of set up to like establish a a workforce of domestic workers, right? Like no one's paying attention to that. It just all seems like that's just the way it always has been, and that's the way it will always be, and like there's no sort of way to overturn that. And I think that's a really fascinating way to point out the ways that gender and capitalism work together to produce a certain type of labor, right? One paid and one not, but they both seem sort of like the right way to live in the world.
Yeah, that's right. So Federici is way more straightforward than Irigare for sure, but I'll say more about Irigare anyway, just because she has a really interesting analysis of gender and capitalism. So she also studied psychoanalysis, so she's especially invested in like the family structure and how it works. And she, to put it like simply, she has this argument where she says the family under capitalism, the bourgeois family, is created in such a way that the man is essentially expected to be the capital accumulator. So the man goes out into the world, does work and makes culture and gets money, and then comes back to the home, and then they can do whatever they want with the capital that they received. It might not be a lot of capital, or it might just be a wage or something like that. The scraps of capital or whatever. But at the end of the day, the man is sort of still they retain the culture work expectation, whereas the woman is expected to stay home and do that domestic labor, like you were just saying, as her contribution to sort of making sure that the engines of capital can still go out from the home and come back in the form of a male husband. And she also has to take responsibility for raising these kids, but the kids end up thinking that the dad is very cool because the dad goes out into the world and is a symbol of the world, right? So there's all kinds of psychoanalytic stuff going on. But what I think is really fascinating is Irigare says, if we abolished capitalism tomorrow, that would be great. But because this pattern of domination has structured how we grow up and live for so long, in also a kind of economic sense, it would not just end gender oppression immediately, because for Irigare, like men don't know what it's like to live in an arrangement outside of that, and women also don't know what it's like to live in an arrangement outside of that either. And can you make certain progress under capitalism to upset those kind of gender norms? Of course you can. Like, people are doing it every day, and that's amazing, right? That's one choke point in capitalism that people should keep forcing. But Irigare's point is so much more profound, which is to say, you have to do these things at the same time, right? Like, you have to fight the class side of it and the logic of capital accumulation, and you have to fight the sort of gender, like the reproduction of gendered understandings that contribute to that kind of accumulation.
Yeah, that that is a different way to put a very similar idea.
Yeah, exactly.
It's cool. Well, I think it goes to, it speaks to the ways that like liberal types of feminism kind of aren't great.
Yeah.
like that see like a woman being the CEO of Raytheon or something as like as a win for feminism or whatever. Like it's not actually if you think about it. But I think that's a good a better way to kind of get a handle on that relationship, right? To take these things together. All right, Dean. So we've talked about two types of like ways identity politics connect with the understanding of class. I think that's really fascinating. But let's turn the page in a wildly different direction. So let's see. A hallmark of the Magnificast is that at least once in every 10 episodes, we will talk about Paul Virilio. It's when we listen when we when we got the contract from the big podcasting firm that we really do work for. It's in there. We have to talk about Paul Virilio every 10 episodes. There's no way around it.
We
So
won't get
let's
our
do
wage
that.
if we don't.
That's it. That's the secret here. So let's see. What can we say about Paul Virilio? If you are not familiar with him, he was. He's dead. R.I.P. Paul Virilio was a Catholic French urbanist, an artist, an architect, and anarchist, kind of. All of these things. He taught architecture. He was a stained glass artist for a minute. Mm, he built this absolutely wild ass church in France. That's really cool. He wrote though a lot about the ways that urbanism and everything is basically moved by militarism. So, like when it comes to Marx, for Marx, the history of the entire world is the history of class struggle. But for Virilio, it's the history of the entire world kind of progresses at the speed of its weapon system. So, where everything for Marx is about labor, everything for Virilio is about military. And basically in his work, it ends up being sort of a competing theory of history with Marx. But I think there's some interesting things we can draw from it rather than just writing it off altogether.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it is a very different pivot from what we were just talking about with identity politics, but it's a nice way of illustrating why class reductionism, can't get you as far as trying to build a lot of other things together can. One thing that, without going into the weeds of Virilio's entire theory, which is extremely weird, one thing that he says that I think is really interesting is that we on the left, people have a tendency to look just at class as the ultimate logic that drives history. But Virilio thinks that the military, if you kind of ignore the logic that the military has in itself, which is a different kind of logic than capitalists, then you will inevitably be probably like bowled over by militarism, no matter what kind of gains you make as a proletarian class. So one example that he always gives is Chile. So for people who don't know, in 1970, a guy named Salvador Allende was democratically elected as the socialist leader of Chile, and he was great. Everybody loved him. He was a great guy, good Marxist, etc. He was deposed in a coup 3 years later by General Augusto Pinochet, and that ushered in a long time of military dictatorship in Chile. And Virilio points at that as a way of saying, the optimism of a certain kind of socialism says that if you just got your hands on the state, if the class was running it, the right class was running it, then you could kind of bring the military to heel or use the military as a tool. But Virilio says the military class has different kinds of ways of understanding its own self-preservation that are different than the bourgeois class. And if you don't sort of see that, when push comes to shove, you will lose because you do not have the guns. And that's a pretty compelling point, I think.
Yeah, it is totally. There's a book that Paul Virilio wrote called Popular Defense and Ecological Struggles, sort of a book he wrote later in his career. But there's a really interesting, I guess, analysis that he's giving to like the military in France, sort of after World War II, in the ways that it becomes kind of like this autonomous entity. It's not something that's controlled even really by the people in any sort of democratic sense. There's a political class that has some kind of influence on it, but at the same time, like it ends up being this sort of thing in and of itself that like I don't know, like what would what would you do, right? Even if even if the proletariat formed some type of revolutionary organization and were successful at winning the workers to their side and like leading the way to a worker state, like what would you do against this organization, right? Like, would they join you? Probably not. What would you do if they didn't? These are like some really interesting questions that I think Paul Virilio gets you to ask when you kind of try on the theory. I think that there are some problems with it in the long run, but
Mhm.
I think it's also like a type of analysis that Marxists can really adopt and try to integrate into their understanding of politics. I think it's worth doing for sure.
Yeah, it's helpful too because, um, one thing that I disagree with for Berlio is that maybe Marxists do have to be part of the military, right? Like, not in the United States perhaps, but like Cuba, you can't understand Cuba without understanding the fact that actually militarism is extremely important for Cubans to defend the gains that they made in the revolution and still today. You could say the same for a place like Venezuela and lots of places around the world, right? Where it matters that there's a military presence. But I think that what Virilio does is he kind of acts as a conscience to get you to recognize that what you really do want, whether you're a Marxist or some other person on the left, is the end of all war, right? Marxists still take themselves to be people of peace, even if they think that you have to use violent means sometimes to get there, and or at least they think sometimes violent means are justifiable in certain situations, not all of them. But all that to say, Virilio's sort of competing theory is like an important way to chastise certain Marxists that, in my opinion, sometimes get a little too pumped up about like shooting people, which I think is not a healthy thing for building a society where lots of people can live healthy and happy lives.
Yeah, I think that's yeah, describing Paul Virilio as a conscious is really great. There's also some strategic things that he suggests that have really easy intersections with Marxism. Like, I mean, Paul Virilio wants it to scale down the militarization, right? Like that. Putting it lightly, I think is probably one of the sort of political goals that he might have, even though it's probably hard to identify as a political goal. But like putting the brakes on things is a thing for Paul Virilio, who has a lot to say about speed. And he does end up saying a little bit about labor here and there in his books. And the working class as a class is sort of complicated for Virilio because he sees them as sort of an extension, I think, of the military state that exists. But at the same time, workers pumping the brakes and going on strike is like I think a still a Virilio and a Virilioian God,
A
a
Virillian.
Virillian idea,
Yeah.
maybe. Yeah, there's an. All I'm trying to say though is there's an intersection there between the way that Marxists think about unions and labor and Virilio. So it's not like these are incompatible ideas, to say the least.
Yeah, I think that's right. We could say a thousand more things about Virilio, but I think the key, I guess, is to say if you commit yourself to a certain class reductionist memeing on the internet or something, you're going to just miss out on a lot of analytic tools, whether it has to do with understanding things like race and gender, or what people wrongly, I think, malign as identity politics all the way down. Whether it's that side, or whether it's actually building a really sophisticated analysis of what it means to participate in a big political struggle or to understand world history. You have to draw on some other stuff, right? And that's a huge thing. Why don't maybe we could pivot toward the end here, talking a bit about how to integrate all this into a certain way of thinking. I mean, the left has tried to do this a lot. There's maybe like successive generations of trying to think through how to put all this stuff together. Like, I always think of there's an incredible black woman communist who was a member of the CPUSA for a long time named Claudia Jones. She wrote quite a lot about the intersections of gender, race, and class as a communist herself. She really did a lot of amazing work there in the activist circles of like the 60s and 70s in the US. They often talked about like double or triple jeopardy. So like, yeah, class oppression, everybody's in jeopardy. But like, let's say that you're a minoritized group, then you might be in double jeopardy. Or if you are a woman in a minoritized group, then you might be facing triple jeopardy. That was one way of trying to get at that. and like a successful organizing vocabulary. But I think one of the most promising and interesting ones today that I think is really wrongly, like intentionally misunderstood on the left is intersectionality. Maybe it would be good to talk about that at the end here. How does that sound?
Yeah, it's a good idea. Let's talk about it.
Okay. I felt like I needed to pause and get your permission before I force this into that conversation.
Of course. You always have my permission to talk about things.
Good. Let me go ahead and read a really neat thing from The Guardian on Kimberly Crenshaw, who is the person who introduced intersectionality in a big way. And then we can talk through it. So there was this article just in November, I think, maybe earlier this month even. Yeah. In The Guardian, where it's sort of like explaining her theory and what she thinks about it, etc. But they touch on class in particular in the article, and here's what it says. Crenshaw's work asked people to think of the privileges they brought into a space and how, through their actions or silences, they contributed to the problem of racism. And we could add also sexism and lots of other kinds of isms. Because of this, intersectionality is often criticized as something undermining the building of a multiracial working class movement. In response, Crenshaw argues that the U.S. will never be able to respond to the problem of class until it interrogates what she describes as the politically stabilizing role of white supremacy in propping up American hierarchies. Quote, "This has been the case since slavery. Why did so many white farmers who were impoverished by this economic system make themselves available, amenable, even champions of an economic system that didn't benefit them?" Important question. She goes on to say, "When people tell me that intersectionality marginalizes class, I say no. Intersectionality is what we need to understand why it's been so difficult to mount a fully class-centric movement." And I think that is really an important key. I mean, if you heard nothing in like the last 40 minutes of just rambling on about other people, like this is really where the rubber hits the road. I think that failing to understand something like intersectionality is actually why it's really difficult to build class solidarity in the first place. So maybe we could sort of draw that out some more, Matt. Any thoughts on intersectionality? Where do you think it gets us?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I mean, it's Kimberly Crenshaw. I mean, okay, let's say this. Kimberly Crenshaw is I think, legal scholar. I'm pretty sure that's true.
Yeah, that's right.
A lot of her early work around intersectionality was about like the ways that women of color were and were not reporting domestic violence, and also around the ways the ways that women of color were not being, I mean specifically Black women, were not being like hired for particular jobs, but it was sort of like flying under the radar because of this like intersectional understanding, or I'm sorry, because of a lack of an intersectional understanding. So she's not a Marxist, but she's bringing like all of these tools to the table. And yeah, just like you're saying, I don't think you can really understand class correctly unless you have some theory that can help you kind of tie these other identity markers into that theory of class, right? Like you're not going to understand any of this without without an understanding of race and gender, and like the ways that like heterosexuality becomes sort of like normalized, and people who don't express themselves in exactly that way get pushed to the sides, or the way that trans people get pushed to the sides, right? Like all of these things kind of like factor into the ways we experience class and work. They're all kind of interdependent with one another, I think, in the ways that they form situations of oppression in people. So yeah, I think that somebody like Crenshaw at least gives us the opportunity and some like language to get at the way these things are all connected.
Yeah, I think that's right. It also like it drives me up the wall, I think, when Marxists in particular get really bent out of shape about intersectionality. And a lot of them do. I'm here to tell you it's a bad habit. You shouldn't adopt it. But I think there's two reasons it bothers me. One is that it wrongly assumes that if everyone would just listen to your specific idea of how Marxism works, the world would just sort of fix itself. And I think that is actually a bizarre liberal kind of fantasy. That's like what Joe Biden thinks. It's just that he's not a Marxist. So don't do that. That's a weak analysis. But the second is that it fails to really reckon with the fact that intersectionality is actually trying to build a popular movement that can address class issues And Marxists work with all kinds of people that are not Marxists and all kinds of movements that sort of share maybe a strategic goal but don't necessarily share every single goal. And I think intersectionality is like a great sort of example of where it's actually good to have a productive dialogue, both because the way Marxists understand class can contribute a lot to one sort of dimension of intersectional analysis. And intersectional analysis can then also open up that Marxist theory of class to lots of other dimensions. So I don't know. I sort of I tend to see intersectionality as a way of just affirming that like you got to get everybody in the room who knows something about oppression and have them all talk about it at once, and then you'll figure out what's going on, rather than being like, okay, I only ever talk to like the people at this table in the cafeteria, and that's it. So don't be those people. That's bad news.
Yeah, totally. I think that's a good way of putting it. Don't be those type of people. Sit at different tables. Have one big table, maybe. I don't know what kind of arrangement of furniture we need here, but listen, it's not just the one where it's only Marxists talking. All right, so let's just like do a quick recap here. Last week we talked about all of the reasons why Christians need to be attentive to the idea of class and kind of figure out class analysis and how it might benefit them, right? Like you want to be a good Christian, you want to love your neighbor just as yourself, because that's in the Bible. So you need to learn about class because that is a good way to kind of understand your neighbor and why they might be oppressed in a way that you're not, or maybe why you have a common cause with them when you might not think you do. Right, all of these things. We told you that last week. And this week we're telling you that it's actually way more complicated than just class. There's a whole lot of other factors that go into our understanding of the political and economic like landscape, right? There's racial capitalism. There's the way that gender influences the way we think about the types of work that come natural to people and all kinds of other things too. There's a whole bunch of I think other subsections of this that we haven't talked about, which it's an hour long podcast, folks. We can't do it all, but there's more stuff out there. There's more ways to kind of like bridge these connections between class and different types of identity politics. I think Marxists ought to be really attentive to. But Dean, let's talk about this. Let's talk about why Christians should care about class reductionism. Let's turn to that page a bit.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I really have, I think, gathered from liberation theology as a tradition is that it has a really expansive idea of what the poor means as a category. And I think that is right. For liberation theologians, the poor is not just an economic category. It involves every kind of marginalization. We had Hector on the show, Hector Sarah Ferrer, a little while back, one of my colleagues at the Institute for Christian Studies here. And something he told me that always sticks with me is like, if you're sitting in a room full of a bunch of different people, the category of the poor, if you're a liberation theologian, might kind of bounce around. Like, there's all kinds of structural oppression that you walk into when you walk into a room full of different people. But then there's kind of, some people might feel more or less capable of speaking or contributing or being heard. And there's this kind of Christian obligation to like hear who's being silenced and try to create space for those people to be able to contribute and to be to be able to bring themselves fully into a situation as an agent and a person with something to say if they want to. And I think that is like a good Christian reason to pay attention to all these different kinds of forms of oppression. Like, it's true that in lots of situations, class is in every situation, class is an important factor, right? There's no situation in which class doesn't matter, and class matters specifically. It has specific things that it sort of relates to and has to do with and all that kind of stuff. But there's going to be all kinds of other things that pile on top of class that might change the way that we understand the sort of distribution of oppression in a situation or a room. And like I said, Christians with this kind of bigger category of the poor can sort of find a way to attune ourselves to that shifting terrain of oppression.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to lay it all out there. I mean, in a time where I think white supremacy is one of the motivating ideas within white evangelicalism, I think these are the tools that you really need to use to maybe think around that situation. I mean, I know that's been the case for me, right? Like, I've definitely come out of a white evangelical tradition. That's a lot of this has been really helpful for kind of thinking through all of that and exactly what it all means, right? At the end of the day, though, if you are a Christian and you think that like what it means to be a Christian is to throw in with people, with the poor in this like big liberation theology sense, if that's like what Christians are supposed to do, then you're not going to be able to even see who these people are and like why the system is working in the way that it is without these tools, right? Without understanding class analysis, but also not understanding racial capitalism or the way that patriarchy works or the way that heterosexism works or whatever, all of these things together. You need all of these things together. You need a way to be able to speak about them together, just like Kimberly Crenshaw says. So I think that these are tools for Christians to use. If you care about the world, if you care about other people, if you care about doing things, then these are the things that you should have in your toolbox.
Yeah, I think that's right. One thing I would add too at the end here is, like we brought up a handful of people that I hope people go check out, whatever, Stuart Hall, Omari Armstrong, Cedric Robinson, Sylvia Federici, Rigori, all these, a whole list of folks. But I think the craziest thing is, or the wildest thing is like, the more you try to understand all these oppressions on their own terms, the more you realize exactly how complicated all this stuff is. Even down to intersectionality, right? Intersectionality is one way that I think is really compelling for organizational purposes. Like, it's a language that people can kind of get on board with in a way that it might be harder to get on board with other kinds of conversations. But like, there is debate within, people trying to figure out the exact constellation between race and capitalism and gender and all that kind of stuff about whether or not intersectionality is the most effective sort of tool for doing that, right? So I don't mean to say that like everything that we've identified are like the ultimate ways of putting everything together, that it's very simple, but it's just to say like at some point you have to start like getting your hands dirty and figuring out like what works and what's going to help you attend to all these different things. I guess what I'm saying is the toolbox is like extremely messy, but you have to like pick them up and go to work. Otherwise you're never going to figure out how anything operates in the first place.
Yeah, I think that sounds good to me. All right, folks, you heard it here. Learn about class. Don't be a class reductionist. Don't be that kind of Marxist. Be the good kind, and figure out how to attend to all of these like sort of co-contributing forms of oppression. It's a struggle worth your time.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast. You can find us on Twitter at the Magnificast. You can find us on email. You can find us on your email at themagnificast@gmail.com. We have like a Facebook group called the Magnificast Basement. It goes in waves of activity. It ebbs and flows. You could be the one to increase its activity if you wanted to, called the Magnificast Basement. Our music, as always, is by Omari Armstrong and the Illogical Spoon. We'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. At least I would else.